Hello and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining me into my Glaivier guide for the western servers of Lost Ark. My name is Wilkie and we're going to be taking a look at the Pinnacle engraving only. For those of you who are interested in the control engraving, I still have the old video from the Russian server, albeit names have changed, the build is going to be still the same there. The only difference is that the control engraving has received a slight buff in terms of damage. Gameplay wise, it's still going to be the same. So what is it that makes this Pinnacle engraving actually so important, or why do most Glaiviers actually prefer this over the other one? The reason is fairly simple. Pinnacle adds on to an already existing mechanic of Glaiviers, and that is whenever you swap stances when you have at least one gauge full, you're gonna get a pretty powerful buff. The focus stance grants movement speed, damage, and critical damage. The flurry stance grants you attack speed, damage to targets, and critical rate. So ignore that typo here, it's actually attack speed, not movement speed. You can see that here, that when we're in moon stance, we have 136% attack speed. Once we're going down to sun, we have 136% movement speed. Likewise, we have the crit damage here, and moon or flurry stance grants us a very large amount of crit. And this is also the reason why Glaiviers are not really dependent on crit sets or crit sources all that much, because they have it pretty much built into their entire kit anyway, as long as your specialization is high enough. And this kind of leads me into the stat build. Anything you want to do, there are deviations between crit and swiftness, but anything you do, you want to rack up your specialization as high as you can. It allows you to gain your build meter, build your meter faster, and it makes the buff even stronger. So the higher your specialization is going to be, the higher or the better the buff stats are going to be. So more specialization means more stats across the board. More damage, more speed, more crit damage, and on flurry, more damage, more speed, and more crit chance. This is incredibly powerful. This is very well built in. You pretty much have everything all in one go. Since I already touched on this, I'm using stats which are more or less targetable in Tier 3. For those of you who are in Tier 1 and Tier 2, try to get your specialization up as high as you can. Whether you take crit or swiftness doesn't really make a whole lot of difference in the early game anyway. Your target priority is definitely specialization, because that's where Glaiviers start to shine. Rack up that specialization, everything else comes in second. Now this is it when it comes to stats and when it comes to the core mechanics of Glaiviers. Likewise, you don't necessarily want to dance, because if you're not in Trixian, what happens is whenever you dance, you have to rebuild that gauge, and if you swap back, you don't actually get anything at all. Even if you build one bar full here, you don't really see the class engraving working. That is because the class engraving only takes effect if your meter is completely full. So PLERs, whenever you swap stances on your Pinnacle Glaivier, only do so when your gauge is actually full, because otherwise you're not going to be able to benefit from your engraving. That aside, I'm going to be now giving you a core build, what I personally believe 99%, maybe even 100% of Pinnacle Glaiviers are going to be using. Now, the reason I want to give you a core build is the following. There are quite a few deviations in Glaivier skill builds. There are stat builds, skill builds, and engraving builds. There's also meta builds and different things. So Glaivier does have a lot of options. This unfortunately creates a lot of confusion, especially for people who never played the game. They're looking at guides and they're seeing vastly different builds, and I can see why it's difficult to understand why things are going one way or another. And typically most people just assess or assume you're going to play the meta build anyway. It kind of makes it hard to see, is this outdated, is this wrong, why does he play this versus that. So I'm going to give you a core build that's going to function on every Pinnacle Glaivier regardless of the engraving and the meta build. For the flurry, or also called moon skills, we have flash kick, classic mobility tool, nothing really crazy about that. Vault is your counter ability. This is a skill that's used to counter. Either use excellent mobility or quick preparation to have it ready on faster. The extra damage or distance lets you counter a bit more consistently, but that is up to you. Half Moon Slash is your first DPS skill on flurry stance. You want flurry expertise, final decision, and I personally prefer Blade of Tornado. But there are some people that really like the Chasing Slash as well. Chasing Slash actually boasts higher DPS than Blade of Tornado. I just really prefer this one. So this is more or less an optional thing. If you prefer the charging version, which also lets you run around a little bit, then by all means go use it. I personally just prefer this one. Rising Dragon Slash, your second go-to damage ability on Flurry Stance, cooldown, Quick Slash, this makes it go a lot faster, and Awaken is what summons these lovely dragons. Also, this grants the damage and another crit rate boost. Lastly, we have Shackling Blue Dragon. Now, this is the reason why Glaiviers are so often welcome in parties, because this debuff does not only help yourself, but also your party members. And this skill grants yourself and your party members an 18% increase of crit rate, which we already talked about it. Glaiviers already have a lot of crit, and they now even have a crit debuff on top of that. So you can see that Glaiviers have no trouble getting their critical rate up very easily by themselves, as long as specialization is high enough. And this is it for the core build when we're taking a look at the Flurry or the Moon Stance. When we're taking a look at the Focus or Sun Stance, there's only 3 abilities here that I think are core. Starfall Pounce, you want weak point, quickly prepare, because this one boosts a lot of cooldown reduction. You can see the max level is a 10-second cooldown reduction, which is massive. Also, the other ones are just not really that valuable, so you really want to take that one. And Powerful Finish lets you guarantee a critical hit on targets that are push immune, which is every raid boss and every guardian in the game. Red Dragon's Horn is your highest nuke that you have. Quickly prepare to have it ready more often. Spear of Destruction, again, lets you guarantee a critical hit for narrowing down the radius. The radius is still pretty big, though. Like, you can aim this quite in wide and arc, and you are guaranteed to have crits and weak point destruction to increase the damage on, again, named or higher foes, which is any guardian, any raid boss whatsoever. Lastly, we have the Dragon Scale Defense, which can function as a panic button. It allows you to parry multiple attacks from whatever direction they're coming. Also, you do counterattack with this. Pretty solid skill. It can be used in a pinch to absorb an AoE that you're unable to dodge, or you're not entirely sure what's happening. You can press this and put yourself behind a wall of 50% of your HP. This cannot be used to ignore one-shots or anything, but it can definitely be used to soak up some moves of the bosses. Like I said, this is the core build that most, if not all, Pinnacle Glaiviers are going to be using. I'm now going to deviate a little bit from that, and I'm going to be talking about options that you can choose in each of the stands. So the first variation that I want to give you is the core or the meta build from the Korean server, and that involves in using increased mass. Now, the reason this is very often used on the Korean server is because Glaiviers don't really have that many options when it comes to using good engravings, especially once you reach the point where you can get 5 or even 5.5 engravings max. For those of you who are in lower levels, I have a build lined up later that I would definitely choose over this one, but let me just show you why this is a thing and why increased mass actually is a good selection if you adjust the skill build accordingly. Remember I told you that swapping from Flurry to Focus grants you movement speed, and focusing or going from Focus to Flurry gives you attack speed, even though the typo is here. And this is used to counter the negative attack speed slow from increased mass. So you don't really feel that engraving all that much. What this encompasses, though, is that most of your skill points and damaging abilities are going to be focused on the Flurry stance. So what we're going to be having here, for example, is Chain Slash, which is another good damaging ability. And then we also have Eclipse Path and the Wheel of Blades, which not only are looking like our cool looking skills, but are actually able to deal a considerable amount of damage. So we're actually focusing most of our DPS rotations and skills onto the Flurry stance in order to compensate for the negative attack speed that we are induced through mass increase. Likewise, in terms of focus stance, you have to bite the bullet and take the negative damage there, but it's only 2 skills and it's not too much of a problem, although you can definitely feel it. The second build that I want to give you guys is the, I guess, the pre-meta build, or the meta build that was pretty much very dominant before we got to the point where people were using mass increase, and that involved using the Awakening engraving. Now, this may not make a whole lot of sense right now, but this build works around the relic set that we will be getting with the Valten raid, and that set allows you to reduce cooldowns and increase damage of every ability whenever you use your Awakening skill for 2 minutes. The problem is you need to reduce your cooldowns on your Awakening abilities enough to actually be able to maintain this buff, ideally infinitely. So you want to be able to reduce your cooldowns on your Awakening abilities to 2 minutes or even less. And that is typically achieved with running the Awakening Engraving. Now, skill-wise, we didn't really change all that much. Just that chain slash now pretty much functions as a mobility tool, so we no longer have the slashes. And also, we took out some points from our Wheel of Blades. The rest is pretty much the same, so you can see that there's not a whole lot of changes. When it comes to the focus stance, we now also use Thrust of Destruction, which is another ability that lets you get guaranteed critical strikes if you take the tripod, the Spear Tip Thrust, and Air Gripping Thrust. So you can see again, you now have 3 abilities which are now able to guarantee you critical hits, even though we have 0% crit in our chance here. As you can see, crit rate is 0%. Meanwhile, our 3 abilities are still going to be critting 100% of the time. Like I said, this build only really functions with the Vulcan set. So if you want to play this kind of route, then you can potentially prepare with it. I would personally not try to go that route until we are at item level 1445 and actually have the Legion Commander. Going over the staple build that works universally regardless of the stages you are in, and you cannot take this as an inspiration. What we're looking at here are the 4 core engravings, which are, I would say, more or less pretty much mandatory regardless of which route you take. The utmost importance is definitely Pinnacle though. Without the Pinnacle engraving, your buff is not going to be nearly as powerful as it is with it, so definitely try to max Pinnacle first. Even if you are in tier 1 or tier 2, getting that Pinnacle to level 3 is going to be pretty handy, especially starting in tier 2 later down the line when you have a good amount of specialization. Grudge and Crystal are universal attack or damage engravings, so I don't think there's any explanation here. And as aforementioned, Keenblood Weapon works really well with guaranteed crits on Sun Stance. Like I said, Focus Stance already has a built-in crit damage, so the effectiveness of Keenblood is not as good on the Focus Stance as it is on the Flurry Stance. Likewise, it's still a very solid pick, as it has no defensive or other drawback. So it doesn't really matter, you don't necessarily need to have all 4 engravings. I personally don't have all 4 engravings either. Like I said though, this is a very core build that will function throughout the entirety of the game until we get to the point where you can get 5 engravings. Ideally, I would pretty much prioritize as follows. The top 1 priority is Pinnacle. The second priority, I would personally either to Crystal or Grudge. That is more of pretty much a preferential style. Some people don't like the increase of damage, so they prefer this one. Likewise, some people prefer taking more damage but being able to heal properly. So this one's pretty much go with everyone you choose. And as a third engraving, I would try to get Keenblood Weapon. And then whenever I have everything going, you can go for all 4 engravings. Now, skill-wise, I actually would run not the mass increase build, since unless you already have mass increase, I think this build is going to be resulting in better overall DPS. So we're going to be taking a look at the skills that I've shown earlier. My Chain Slash is going to run the Swoop Tripod, so it's just going to be mobility. My Wheel of Blades is just going to be that, and I will have the Thrust of Destruction. Should you not really be a fan of Thrust of Destruction, you can always change it back to Chain Slash. Like I said, the core skills are going to be the same. It's really just more about what you actually have in terms of preference and what your playstyle is going to be all about. That-wise, like I said, priority is always specialization. Try to top it off with Swiftness. If you don't have Swiftness, go for a crit necklace or something. That is fine as well. When it comes to low skill points, so you're starting out on the game, ideally, you will get those 2 abilities maxed. Offman Slash, Raging Dragon Slash, Shackling Blue Dragon, that is really good. Starfall Pounce, and Red Dragon Horn. Like I said, this is a core fundamental build that's going to be functional. It's going to allow you to clear Guardians and lower Abyssal raids. This is really pretty much all you need. Once you start getting more skill points, you can start adding onto skills like Flash Kick for the extra mobility, Vault if you want, Chain Slash to make it a mobility skill, or Wheel of Blades for example, so that it reduces your mana cost or starts dealing extra damage. You can see that the core of Glaiviers are actually very easy to set up, thus you don't necessarily need a whole lot of skill points. However, the more you have, the better your performance is going to be. So likewise, this was, like I said, a very core skill build. After that, it's pretty much get any of the remaining skills up and try to figure out if you prefer more of the focus skills or if you prefer more of the flurry skills. Lastly, I want to show you guys what I actually am using, and you may ask yourself, like, why is he using this if he wants to use something different? There are two core reasons why I use the increased mass version. First of all, when I played on the Russian server, the increased mass meta wasn't there, so I never really thought about using it. Secondly, I want to try out this build and see if it's something for me that I personally like or don't like, as in, you know, just because it's meta doesn't necessarily mean that it fits your playstyle or that it's something that you really like or, like, kind of understand. Thirdly, it was much cheaper to go this kind of route than to go anything else. And for example, Ether Predator is a very good off-meta engraving that doesn't really have any negative drawback. And I so happen to get a stone that has Ether Predator 5 on it. So unfortunately, the stone also has a attack speed reduction on it, so I'm kind of like doubling down on the increased mass negative. But again, Glaivier takes care of that, so this is pretty much what I'm using. Likewise, I currently only run 2 focus skills, and I pushed some of my skill points into the flurry skills, namely Chain Slash, and I just saw that I can actually, actually have enough skill points to put this one. So this is what my build would be looking like. So this is the reason why I'm actually playing this build right now. With the release of Vulcan and whenever I hit 1445, I'm probably going to go back to the Awakening set route. I'm not entirely sure yet. I'm still kind of like in the testing phase of why I want to use things, and if I really like the increased mass, because to be fair, I'm not a big fan of the increased mass engraving, I'll give you that much. It's a good one, it's a fairly cheap one, and Glaiviers can definitely play around that if you prefer to play in the flare stands. I just really like the focus stands, so for me it's kind of like not exactly what I want to do. I have 2 more sections to go over. The first one is a baseline rotation of what your gameplay is going to look like. So we don't have any cooldown reduction or anything going on. As you can see right now, we're like really slow, and the first thing or the first goal that you need to do is to get your gauge up. For me personally, I find it much easier to stack up my gauge in the focus stands because I'm not used to having attack speed in focus stands anyway. So for me, building the gauge up in focus is easier, but whichever way you do, it doesn't really matter. You have to start getting into the cycle. Once your meter is full, the rotation starts. Typically, start with Shackling Dragon. That gives you enough gauge for some of the tripods to work. And then it's pretty much just wail away with whatever you have. Same thing here. We swap back. We're going to use our nukes. And we're pretty much already done with the focus rotation. Also, you can see that my cooldowns are very gently back up again. And you can see that we are now back in here. And that is pretty much it. It's a very straightforward playstyle. It's not too complex. It's nothing too difficult. And depending on the build and depending on what you like, the changes here may or may not really reflect what your playstyle is going to look like or what you personally want. The last thing I want to give you guys is other engravings that you could potentially go for, which are either off-meta picks or can be used. Like I said, the mass increase one focuses on improving your potential DPS on every stance, but it really works well on the flurry stance because you don't really feel the negative engraving there. For the fact that we have a lot of movement speed on our focus stance, Raid Captain can be used as an alternative should you take the 3 or maybe even 4 focus skills, because that's when you get a good chunk of extra damage, simply because we have 137% movement speed here, which is pretty good. And these are, like I said, these are my accessories from tier 3. So you can see that I'm almost at the cap for Raid Captain to give me maximum damage increases. This is another option. Like I said, the problem with Glaiviers really starts to shine in that there's not really any optimal engraving for both stances. So you gotta see what build is it that I like, what skills do I prefer, and kind of like mix and match the engravings according to that. And that sums it up for my Glaivier. Again, Pinnacle only build. For those of you looking at Control, check out the link in the description below. I do hope this was helpful. I do wish you guys have fun with the Glaivier class. I definitely do have it. I'm so happy that we actually got it so fast. I'm really happy about this. If you have any questions, as usual, I will be putting anything down in the description below. There's also going to be a skill calculator, but I need to find one that's actually up to date. So I'm trying to look up a website or something that I actually can use. Aside from this, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot it out in the comments or anything, and I'll gladly answer any questions. Thank you all for being here, and I'll see you next time.
Stay in fact.